Thanks for giving your time today. And I want to introduce my colleague here, Kris, who can tell you a little bit more about himself.
Thanks so much, Kelly. My name is Kris Jagasia, and I work for a company called Off2Class, and we're a toolkit used by district EL programs, typically for middle and high school students, and often for long-term Ls. And we're an ELD toolkit, English language development, and we combine a couple different tools into one place. And what I'm excited to present here today are strategies related to that you can incorporate or think about for your long-term Ls for next year, or even for what's remaining of this year, that are irrespective of off to class. So I'm going to show a couple things in off to class, but you can certainly incorporate some of those strategies into your own tools that you might have access to.
So if you're here, I imagine you have some experience with the topic because that's what brought you in, but just a little bit of background in case you are new to the topic or want to share the video later with others who may not. Long-term English learners. So officially, the long-term English learners are defined in all the federal guidelines as a student who's been enrolled in an English language development program for 6 or more years without reaching what each state defines as English proficient. So that varies from state to state, usually somewhere between a level 4 and level 5 of English proficiency on the various assessments that are out there. Kris was able to find some data which kind of surprised me, even after having been in the field for 27 years, that 59% of secondary English learners have the long-term label. And that makes sense to me, I guess, because a lot of our secondary students are either long-term or newcomer. There's very few in the middle, some who are newly starting into programs who come in there adolescent years, but that really is the smaller group. And 1 in 3 districts report that 75% or more have the long-term label. So this really is a growing group that I don't think districts have a lot of answers for. So we hope that we can join in that conversation and bring at least some ideas to the table today. So the research around this comes up a lot when we're working with teachers to say, why does the federal government start looking at us funny when students are in the program more than 6 years, when research says very clearly everywhere that becoming proficient takes 5 to 7 years, and that's with adequate supports. So while I won't even begin to try to rationalize why governments do what they do when they make education rules, the part that I think is important for us here is that adequate supports. That's where I feel like in all of the experience with English learners that we're lacking in those adequate supports when it comes to long-term English learners. I feel like we pretty much give all of our students a quality English language development program. If they start in kindergarten or pre-K, usually by 3rd grade or so, they exit. And then there are some who hang on for a little longer, and then some who hang on for longer. And after a while, we kind of run out of ideas of what we can do with them when they've kind of exhausted our curriculum and such. So again, hopefully you'll get a couple ideas today that will inspire you to try a few other things.
Great. And when we were doing some research for the NABE conference this year, we came across this what I think is a great graph from California Together that they published a couple years back. And in trying to understand the point Kelly just made around supports and adequate supports that are designed for long-term English learners, a couple different reports had identified that long-term English learners share very common characteristics with other groups, particularly in English language learner groups, as well as groups that require academic support. And that often in program design, a lot of the strategies and supports that are developed within a program might really be sharing from other groups. So before we jump into some of the supports and strategies that we're going to share with you today, we really just wanted to show you that the program that you might be teaching in, the program that you might be in charge of, might very well be using the characteristics of other groups in its design of its strategies for long-term English learners.
Some of the things that we typically build into English language development programs for long-term English learners are here. We'll talk through that a little bit. And I would imagine you're already doing some or more of those. And this is relevant for elementary through secondary, and we'll talk more later about how we differentiate those out. Of course, there aren't nearly as many elementary long-term English learners because it doesn't really kick in until just as they're getting ready to leave elementary school. But a lot of the ideas and practices and thoughts behind this will apply to those students, say, 4th, 5th grade on as well. So some of the things we recommend most often when we're working with districts with long-term English learners is that attention to oral language development as a basis for literacy. In elementary school, our students typically get the regular language arts program, perhaps guided reading, maybe phonics-based programs, all of those things that are part of a typical elementary school language arts program. What we find sometimes is the missing piece with our long-term English learners is that development of the literacy, the higher levels of reading and writing that will lead them toward exiting a program and becoming proficient. So adding increased focus in the earlier years, beginning in kindergarten and up, to that oral language development, really getting into academic conversations, discourse, all that really structured turn and talk, think, pair, share, talk, moves, all of those conversation strategies that we then take the oral language and move it into written form, reading and writing. And part of that is creating these high interest co-created texts for reading, which are texts that the teacher and the students create together around a topic that is interesting to everyone. So for example, if we bring in the next bullet also, project-based learning into that. Let's say we're talking about a particular topic like geography and travel, and we're working some social studies into that. We might be working some environmental kinds of topics into that. So it's high interest, current and relevant. So as we're talking about it, if we take a project-based approach, the students need a real audience, a real purpose for communicating about the content, whatever it may be, beyond just let me write something for my teacher. So let's say we're going to present to the community about an environmental issue in our neighborhood, something like that. And we can co-create a model text. So this is how we can get into the reading and writing with students. We focus first on the oral language. We talk about it. I, as the teacher, will take notes as we're using their strengths in listening and speaking to scaffold. Taking notes of all their ideas they want to share, putting those ideas into words, going back, rereading those ideas, getting the literacy in. And then together we create a model of what the final product should look like. when we take that kind of literacy approach with our older students, those who I would say fourth grade and beyond, who just aren't as successful reading from a text, they can usually read at a level significantly higher with texts that you create together versus handing them a textbook or a reader or something like that. Their proficiency level in reading jumps up because it means something to them, they're invested in it, and they were part of the process, so they recognize some of the words, they're making visual connections, they are making content connections. So in some ways, kind of putting the textbooks aside and using our own created materials for literacy, and then coming back and bringing the text back in after we feel more confident in those topics. So once we get into this reading and writing and literacy development, we want to start looking at where are their gaps and holes in their language when we think about the different ways they're scored in English language development, in their vocabulary, in their sentence structures, in their cohesion and organization. Where are there holes that we can incorporate into our co-created text? So let's say we notice that their vocabulary isn't very sophisticated. You know, they're not using content words that we're learning. So when I'm modeling, I'm going to make sure I get that in there into the model and into the conversation. Let's say their sentence structures are still very simple. They're not stretching ideas. They're not combining ideas. They're not getting into more complexity. So then I want to use strategies like sentence patterning, where I show them what higher level sentences look like and sound like, and they use those as models. And we are challenged to then incorporate some of those types of models into our co-created text as well. And then when I'm creating a mentor text, I make sure that I use that target structure. Or let's say we're working on sequencing, or we're working on transitions and flow, whatever it is our target is, I'm making sure it gets into that mentor text, and I'm telling them about it, and I'm telling them why, and being super explicit about all of that. So that I know could be a whole like full day workshop plus in itself, which we could talk about later. But those are the big ideas. So as we go through and have those types of structures in place, then our next step is to really get more diagnostic, technical, and explicit, like this slide says. And here's where I think our gap is in instruction. We use all of these best practices, but sometimes it's a little hit and miss, you know, like shot in the dark. So what we want to do is really look at what students are already doing. Think about those formative and summative assessments, looking at student work. Kris will share some other ideas in a minute about that. How can we find out what exactly they're already using and what they're missing? So we are being super targeted. And then think about what can I give them to add to their toolkit so that they are able to move up. So let's say we're writing about a level 3. What pieces of a 4 can I put in today's lesson to help start moving them in that direction? So being very technical, and then explaining to students, being very explicit. We need to make your sentences more complex. So we're going to model that, what it looks like, what it sounds like, and I'm going to expect you to do the same thing in your writing. If they know why you're going there and that it's important, they're much more willing to do that. So what I saw in my weakness as a teacher or as a curriculum writer is that I didn't always know what those things are. Like what should I target? Where do I get that from? How do I know which structures are we missing? And that's where I found Off2Class to be super helpful. And Kris is going to share with you in a moment about that. is using a tool such as this to help me find what it is that's missing and then what I need to target. And then, of course, lots of ways in which to do that. So I'll let Kris kind of walk you through that part.
Thanks, Kelly. So really building off this theme of diagnostic, technical, and explicit, what I'd like to show you today are a couple example strategies on Off2Class that could be used as interventions that really tick those three boxes when we're thinking about long-term English learners. So I'm going to throw you three example strategies today. They're going to be using Off2Class, which is where I come from. But what I'm hoping is that for everybody here and anybody watching the recording is that this can inspire you to develop your own intervention strategies using whatever tools you might have in-house or whatever tools you use within your program. So the first one I'm going to show you is called a gap analysis. And what the gap analysis on Off2Class does is it's a diagnostic that's typically sent to a student at the start of an academic year or when they're being rostered or directed for a year of study. And the nice thing about um, our gap analysis is that what happens is we do get a level diagnostic, an overall aggregate level diagnostic. So B2 in CEFR terms might be a student that's reaching level 5, level 6. But what we find with long-term English learners time and time again is that even though their aggregate score might be quite adequate um, for a testing out kind of strategy, is that there's all sorts of fossilized errors left behind um, at a lower level than their aggregate score would indicate. So in the case of my student Jose, this is actually
Hey, Kris, sorry to interrupt. In my crazy clicking, I accidentally muted you. I'm sorry. Can you
no
go back a
problem,
minute?
no problem whatsoever. So in the case of my student here, who's got an aggregate level of a B2, which is CEFR, but in a state assessment might be reaching. Um, he has a number of what we would like to call fossilized errors that have been left behind as he's gone through his English learner programming over the years. So for example, he's mixing up his subject pronouns, singular plurals, present simple, this, that, these, those, present continuous. So from a diagnostic perspective and taking kind of explicit technical interventions, for me, when I'm working with a student like Jose, it's easiest to fix his lowest level errors first. And if we think about state assessments, but if we also think about just normal life, if we were to meet an English learner out in the real world um, who might be very proficient, might be reaching overall, but at the same time is mixing up subject pronouns, we might, maybe not us because of our professional backgrounds, but society at large might perceive this student to basically be a beginner or high beginner. Um, so cleaning up these fossilized errors can sometimes be the most valuable interventions that a teacher might take with an English learner, because it's these kind of fossilized errors in an explicit sense are probably some of the easiest things to clean up that might be holding back this student. So in the case of off to class, these links all link to lessons and homework, and there's a series of tools that I'll link here that the teachers can use. In the case of building of using this as an example to build your own strategies, you'd be able to prepare your own level diagnostics at the start of the year and kind of build that individual curriculum like we have here for this student, Jose, and really think about how you can take a kind of intervention that's designed to clean up fossilized errors for your students. Um, the other example of a intervention that I wanted to present is really when it comes to the production skills. Kelly had mentioned this on the previous slide when she discussed the communicative kind of nature, the oral communication nature. What we find with long-term English learners is that the lacking can often be on production. So the more passive skills, listening and reading and general comprehension might be very strong, but when it comes time to produce the language, particularly speaking, um, that's where we can really be struggling. And so if I was going to design an intervention focusing on speaking and writing, I'll just show you an example of how we work this into off to class. So off to class has a huge category of speaking activities, all sorts of different topics. This one is on Facebook and social media. And what I want to do with a long-term English learner is I want to give them an opportunity to produce the language when I'm not there, because that really starts to mimic exam day. And I'm sure we've all experienced students that seem like they are relatively proficient and reaching when it comes to their speaking capabilities. But then on exam day, on test day, these scores are lower than we would have assumed. So what I want to try to do in this intervention is have the student record themselves in a computer app adapted model and then deliver that recording back to me as the assessor so that I can review it asynchronously. So the way we mimic that with off to class is we'll assign our lessons using a flipped approach, so that the student basically reviews the lesson in their own time, answers some short questions to make sure they understand the target vocabulary, and then it goes right into recording themselves. Well, first writing written responses and then recording themselves, um, giving the responses to these questions that often ask them to relate to their own experience or relate to their own opinions, um, and they almost always include a long form multiple paragraph answer here. So that is an example of a intervention that's really honing in on the production skills. And the word asynchronous here, um, I would I would consider that one, or I would highlight this one when you might consider how to develop your own interventions, because what we found, certainly over the years that I've been working with district teams, is that often when it comes time for test day, um, there's a perceived underperformance by the program, um, from the student's perspective, because um, when you were with the students synchronously, production skills seemed pretty strong, but when it went time to record themselves using the computer adapted model of many of the state assessments, um, there seemed to be some issues. So using an asynchronous approach for this intervention, um, obviously off to class, what I was just showing you has the recorder built in so the students can record themselves and deliver it back to you. But there's all sorts of online recorders or different tools that you could use to mimic that kind of exam, that test day preparation. So it's just an idea there. The intervention I was showing you has the students write a response first and then record themselves. It is not timed, um, but adding that element of timing could be another idea on how to take this forward one step further, to really give that simulation of test day. And of course, providing feedback on the response. So however you design your intervention, for these production skills, my advice would be to have the students submit the the recorded oral response to you and set up some sort of system where then asynchronously you can listen to the recording and you can give feedback, so they can try it again and see if they can work in some of your feedback, into the next time you have them record themselves, answering kind of a longer form question, asking them to use some target vocabulary and also relate their responses, to their own experiences and their own opinions. And then finally, I was going to go over a synchronous intervention for when you're running classes or workshops and you have your students with you, at the same time. So as Kelly mentioned, most of long-term English learners, or if not all, are in high school or late middle. Um, so keeping in mind that the content that you use for your conversation classes, for your synchronous classes, making sure it's engaging. So a lot of these high school students will have been through, several programs already within your district, within your schools, and keeping in mind that the content that we were using with them 2, 3, 4 years ago, might not be the suitable content to engage them now at this stage of their English learning career. Um, so I'll use an example on off to class on engaging content that's, designed more for the high school level. Um, but this is just an example, like the other two interventions, to give you guys some ideas. So this is an example of a synchronous style lesson on off to class. There's teacher notes there to guide the teacher. I will get rid of the teacher notes so that I can just be showing the lesson content. And what you'll notice is I picked a lesson from a unit on jobs. Um, and one really, really interesting, kind of piece of feedback was given to me by, an English language learner coordinator a couple weeks ago. And she mentioned, one of her issues was exactly this: having content that's designed, that's engaging for high school students. And what she mentioned is, a lot of her long-term English learners in at home and in their home culture and in their home country would actually be considered adults. And so she needs content that's really targeted towards that persona. So that's why I chose the unit on jobs, because it was a really interesting tidbit. Um, but so basically, you can see that for an older student, um, that might have been exposed to different ideas on travel, different kind of challenging pursuits, um, has different ideas for, where they like to see their future. You can see how this content might relate in, and be more appropriate. Now, the other reason I chose this lesson is because the primary objective of this unit is to go over the second conditional. Um, Now, that's obviously quite a technical part of the language. One of those higher order technical parts of the language that we definitely want our students to kind of be exposed to and be comfortable with. But that ability to bring in a technical part of the language and incorporate it into content that is engaging, that is bright, um, that might speak to some older students is really why I wanted to kind of expose that to you here, and to give you some ideas in your own curriculum development, and planning for next year and beyond. So that's an example of just an intervention that can be worked in when it comes to kind of synchronous conversation classes. And I will hand back over to Kelly.
Kris, could you go back to the slide for a second that shows the placement test results?
Absolutely.
I had a
Sorry.
thought there.
And I know I was muted for just a little bit of this, so sorry about that for anybody.
No, that's okay. I wanted this, I wanted to use this for a second to go back to that idea of co-created text and kind of feeling like I was being hit and miss and what I was putting in them and not sure where I wanted, what is it exactly they need? So once I saw this, it really got me thinking that here is the perfect place. So I can go to the gap analysis, I can look through and say, okay, of this group that I'm working with, I have a number of students who have a recommended lesson in pronouns. So today, that's my focus. So I'm being more targeted because I'm not just picking pronouns because it's something I know how to teach or I like to teach. It's something that I know that they need. For me, that gap analysis really comes in those higher levels, like an intermediate and higher, those pieces where we're trying to really get them to exit, of where my ideas and understanding around teaching grammar are not as well developed. And so I would go in and say, what pieces of grammar are these higher level students missing and how can I fill that in? I'm going to put that in my model text. I'm going to assign a lesson and off to class with that. I'm going to make that, use some frames around that. I'm going to use that in my rubric or my expectations. And that way I'm making sure that I'm picking things that I know that are missing that they need to be able to move forward. So I just kind of wanted to come back to that and show how those two ideas connected. So in thinking about where to go, what comes to mind for me is really thinking about your school improvement plan, goals, and strategies. So where in your school improvement plan is there a goal around long-term English learners? And if not, could you influence that? That there are certain goals that could focus on academic language or on a focus on higher level discourse, maybe provide some kind of supplemental instruction asynchronously, as Kris was mentioning. If you aren't in the world that has influence over the school level goals, then definitely working on individual goals, looking at that gap analysis and thinking about each student's place and what they need. So it can help you with goal setting, help you write those plans that each district is required to have. And again, think about your supplemental summer programming or after school extended day programs that you might be able to do through Title III. And how you can do a mix. Now that we're used to this online world, I know there's a big equity issue when it comes to English learners in the online world, but if you have students who are comfortable in this place and maybe don't have the best schedule that matches with high school or even middle school, they have to work. This is a way that you can get them some supplemental instruction and then you can join them as well for parts of it. in the way that Kris was describing, synchronous and asynchronous. So some things to think about as you go forward.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
And I would also say that going forward, now is a great time. Obviously, I know that it's been quite the year for everybody, but now is a great time to start planning for some interventions and strategies and implementations for next year. Um, so I hope that my participation gave you some ideas on developing specific strategies that could fit into your program. Um, we are here for the next 19 minutes. I know that there's been a lot of activity in the chat, so perhaps Kelly, you could feel free to bring some kind of common questions forward that we could address now, whether it's for myself or for yourself. And I'll just mention that you can go check out Off to Class at OFF2Class.com. There is a free account there. If you sign up, it gives you access to 150 lessons. And most importantly, it allows you to send the placement test. So if you want to see how a gap analysis could look, if you go set up a free account, you could send a placement test to yourself. You'd have to kind of pretend that you're a student. So you'd have to set up a fake student account, and then you could go answer the placement test really quickly. And then you'd have an example there of what an individual learning plan, what a gap analysis could look like. And it might give you inspiration for your own program and or using some of your own tools and your own materials as well. So feel free for anybody here to go check out Off to Class. And
There is one question that jumped out at me because this is something that we were recently working on. So someone asked if Off to Class aligns with WIDA, so the WIDA standards, WIDA assessments. I know the majority of the states and a lot of international schools. So just to give a real quick answer to that, I have been working with Off to Class folks here to start doing that and putting things together to show how and where the Off to Class lessons are aligned with the new WIDA standards. And I know that Off to Class is going through the process of, Kris, remind me again?
Yeah, no, that's great. So the short answer is Kelly's done a fantastic job of preparing a mapping document between the Off to Class curriculum and the new WIDA standards, and we're just doing some Q&A on that and going back and forth a bit with the folks at WIDA, and we're hoping to have a release of that or we will be having a release of that document to all the schools that are using Off to Class for next academic year. We are also Off to Class's first in line for the WIDA Prime designation. They've released a new WIDA Prime designation that's specific to the new standards. And so right now they've put on hold publishers that can get that new designation as they finalize some of that some of the work they're doing there on their side, the WIDA folks. But anyways, Off to Class is going to be the first one in line for that new designation, which should come in July. So that's exciting. And then as far as WIDA assessments are concerned, Off to Class is mapped using CEFR, which is a kind of a more global benchmark on English language proficiency, but CEFR maps easily to all the different state assessments, WIDA and across. So that's a very long-winded answer there. And if you have questions on WIDA alignment or anything like that, when you go to offtoclass.com, you'll see a little chat widget in the bottom right. You can just start a conversation there, and someone will answer some of those more specific questions.
Right. And so as Kris was saying, if you're not in a state that uses WIDA, if you have your own assessments, other assessments, all of the assessments across the board, internationally, and across the states, are all required to be aligned to the research. And the research is very clear on the step-by-step developmental process of acquiring language. So being aligned to one or the other, it's not just geared toward one assessment, but that whole language development research in general. So whichever assessments you're using, I would say it would not be much of a stretch at all to show that it is aligned to that, and especially supporting that the speaking and that Kris was talking about, that we just don't have many resources for, as we do in other, like we do for our reading and writing. We have tons of resources, but not for speaking practice, which we've noticed is a big issue of late. Let's see what other questions are in here. It says, in the gap analysis, do students see a list of choices for each question? Is it multiple choice? I think that means.
That's a great question. So this is what the teacher or the school gets back. To see what the student experiences on the placement test, you'd have to go set up an account and set yourself up as a dummy student. But basically, the off-the-class placement test, you have the choice of including listening, reading, writing, and speaking with the grammar portion of the test. What I'm showing you right now is just the diagnostic that comes back from grammar. The reason I did that was because I wanted to hit that theme of, an explicit technical diagnostic intervention for a long-term English learner. But if I were to, so this is the diagnostic that comes back from the grammar portion, and these are all answers to multiple choice questions. If I was to also assign listening, reading, writing, and speaking, the listening and reading, the two more passive skills, are timed listening comprehension and timed reading comprehension, multiple choice. And the two productive skills, writing and speaking, they're not auto-graded. They get my students to have a timed response to a short writing excerpt or a short speaking recorder opportunity. But the gap analysis from the perspective of a technical intervention, you would be equipped with that even if you only assign the grammar portion. And the grammar portion only could be completed in 45 minutes. So it's not as if you're taking, I mean, the more we test our students, every time we test our students, we take away class time. We take away valuable class time. So we're very cognizant of that. That student time is a scarce resource, and every test takes away from it. But in this case, you'd only be taking a 45-minute block of time to produce this diagnostic at the individual student level.
Okay, there was a question about secondary or K through 12, and I would say I'll let Kris answer in a second from the knowing a lot more about the intention on the development side of it, but from the user side of what I've been through, fortunate enough to say that in that process of aligning to the WIDA standards, it went through every single lesson slide by slide. And
yeah.
so what I can,
because I thought it's too hot. I didn't want Dan to walk into a hot,
Oh, we won't spend too long at the house. We'll look at the garden. I want to drop some stuff.
what I can say from there is that the beginning levels, so the off-to-class lessons are set up by proficiency level chunks. Kris, if you want to show the screen that kind of shows the whole collection, there you go. So the beginning levels, like the ones across the top, the level A's are definitely elementary appropriate. I would say to be able to function in the test, I would say at least probably second grade and above to get decent results from the assessment, because some literacy is required.
Yeah.
As far as the topics and the content, there are adults and such in the pictures, but the topics in those lower level lessons are definitely something that students of all ages can relate to. I think for the younger students, I would use it as an introduction, as a support for me as the teacher, as kind of a catalyst for the conversation. Maybe not go, slide by slide through the lesson, but definitely as a resource and support. And then for the older students, that you could definitely make it less teacher-led. Really use the lessons with in those proficiency levels. The topics do become a little bit more older, age appropriate for, like Kris said, things that teenagers or adults would be interested in. So
Yeah.
you just kind of have to jump around and see like what you're looking for and what fits the students who are in front of you.
Absolutely. Kelly, I think that's like that's exactly how I would have said it. It's young learner safe. But as far as target audience would be some of the older learners, but the toolkit is pretty wide across placement testing, synchronous lessons, homework, micro assessments. The toolkit's pretty wide, so you'd have to take a view on where we could fit best for your style.
Right.
And,
I was just.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Kelly.
I was just looking. We're talking about that time crunch, because I know ESL programs everywhere have such a wide range of how much time you get with students, and it's getting less and less and less as we get more and more students and not more teachers. So that's something to also keep in mind, that when you could use that asynchronous option to give students who are motivated, students who have some parental support at home, who might work on this even with their parents, which would be great for their parents as well. I did talk to some folks about using this for parent programs in the past. If you have students who have that kind of motivation or support, they could definitely work at home, again, an after school program, or if you have open media center hours where they might be working. If they have time in class that is, I'm thinking elementary school, of like stations or centers or independent work time where they might do something that's a little more relevant to them and they can work asynchronously. You can assign certain lessons to students and assign them homework, and then you get a notification when they do it. So just kind of, keep an open mind about, it doesn't have to be right there with you. You can do your normal thing in your class time, and then off to class can be kind of that piece that they can go to whenever. You can squeeze in an extra minute. Scrolling through some questions here.
And just to kind of recap my how to get in touch with me or my team, if you wanted to after today, and it doesn't need to be talking about off to class at all. If you want to discuss some of these intervention strategies and how you can develop them in-house with your own tools, your own curriculum, always happy to chat. On the off to class website, this is where you sign up for free. So you could actually go send yourself a placement test by signing up free. And then if you wanted to chat to someone from my team, just scroll down a bit. There's a button that says request a demo. And then that will get routed back to my team, who will give you a call and set up a convenient time to show you around.
Great. And I put in the chat box the link. After we close today, it takes Zoom a little bit to process the video, get back to us. Takes me a few minutes to get it uploaded to our website, but later this afternoon, if you are on our email list, you subscribe to our email list, you will get an email with a link to the recording and the slides that you can refer back to and share. And if for some reason you don't see that email, if it goes to spam or you're not subscribed, you can go back to the link that I put in the chat box or the link where you signed up for this webinar. And that sign up page will turn into a replay page and you can find everything there. If you're not finding it or you're not seeing the messages, the info@englishlearnerportal.com email comes straight to me. Feel free to send me a note and I can point you in the right direction and can also point you to Kris and his team if the questions are better answered by them.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thanks so much for hosting us, Kelly.
No problem. Anytime. I like working with my Off2Class friends here.
Fantastic. And for everybody that participated today, thank you for working us into your busy day. I know it's been a busy year and I'm really grateful that you gave us a bit of your time.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us, to Kris and the rest of the Off2Class team. I saw you popping up in the chat there. And we have a few other webinars coming up about unaccompanied youth and a few other things. So feel free to check out our webinar page and see if one of those works for you as well. And we will be in touch. So thank you again for joining us and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you so much. Bye, Kelly. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for participating.